Julia never imagined that her life would fall apart so quickly. At 38, she had everything she had ever dreamed of: a stable marriage with Ricardo, a teenage son named Lucas, a promising career, and the security of knowing that she was part of her husband's family business, a business she had helped build from scratch. But stability was an illusion. It all started when Julia's father passed away suddenly, forcing her to return to her hometown for the reading of his will. She expected to receive her share of the inheritance, since she had always been the only legitimate child. However, she was greeted with false smiles by her stepmother and half-siblings, who informed her that she had been completely disinherited. The surprise was followed by an infamous accusation. They claimed that Julia had financially abused her father, convincing him to leave his fortune to her before he died. Even though she knew this was a lie, Julia found herself powerless when her own lawyer warned her that contesting the inheritance would be a long and expensive battle. Still reeling from her family's betrayal, she returned home trying to find comfort in her husband, but what she discovered was even worse. During a dinner at her mother-in-law's house, Ricardo announced that he had decided to restructure the company, and that for legal reasons, Julia would no longer have any rights over it. The shock came like a punch in the stomach. She looked at the table and saw her mother-in-law and brother-in-law exchanging satisfied glances, as if everything had already been decided long before that night. Feeling suffocated, she tried to argue, but was met with cold words. "It's better this way for the family." The final blow came when Ricardo handed her a stack of documents and, with a tone of false empathy, suggested that she sign without complicating things. But Julia was no fool. With trembling fingers, she hid her cell phone under the table and began recording the conversation. Something about that story was wrong, and if they were ready to stab her in the back, she also needed to be prepared to fight back. In the following days, Julia began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Ricardo's relationship with his mother and brother was closer than she had imagined. Secret meetings, whispers on the phone, and documents that mysteriously disappeared from the office desk began to form a pattern. But she didn't have time to investigate her suspicions further, because an even bigger problem arose. Lucas, her son, was accused of theft during an event at his paternal grandparents' house. Someone claimed to have seen the boy take an expensive watch that belonged to his new brother-in-law. The accusation was enough to tarnish his reputation at school, even leading to an anonymous tip that almost cost him his enrollment. Julia knew that this was no coincidence. They were trying to destroy her completely, even affecting her son. Determined to prove her and Lucas's innocence, she began to investigate. By combing through bank records and old messages, she discovered a trail of suspicious transfers that led directly to her ex-husband's new wife. What seemed like a simple setup to defame her turned out to be something much bigger. The woman was drowning in gambling debts and had been embezzling money from the family business for months. But the discovery came at a price. As soon as Julia began to question the situation, her own name appeared in a complaint about embezzlement of company funds. The accusation came directly from Ricardo, who did not hesitate to call her a thief in front of everyone. The humiliation was public and brutal. Julia was dismissed from the company without warning, and her bank account was frozen under the pretext of a fraud investigation. The same lawyer who had previously advised her on the inheritance now refused to represent her. She realized that she was being isolated in every aspect of her life, as if every detail had been planned so that there would be no way out, and it didn't stop there. The next day, police knocked on her door with a search warrant. They ransacked her house, went through Lucas's things, and in the end, they found exactly what they were looking for: a wad of cash hidden in her purse, which she knew she hadn't put there. It was a dirty, calculated game, but who was pulling the strings? With her world falling apart around her, Julia received an anonymous message that rekindled her hope. It was from a former employee of the company, someone who had always shown her respect. In the text, he said he knew the truth about the illegal transfers and had proof that the fraud was, in fact, a scheme run by Ricardo and his family. But there was one problem: he was being threatened. If Julia wanted definitive proof, she would need to act fast. Before she could think straight, another bombshell dropped on her lap. A social worker showed up at her house, saying that an anonymous complaint had been made questioning her ability to care for Lucas. Now, in addition to losing her money and her reputation, she was at risk of losing her own son. Julia felt despair take over, but she couldn't afford to break down. If she wanted to save her life and protect Lucas, she needed to act intelligently. With the help of her former employee, she managed to access documents hidden in the company's records and discovered something even more serious. Not only were Ricardo and his family embezzling money, but they were also using the business to cover up tax fraud. That's why they were willing to destroy her if she spoke. They could end up in jail. And worse, she realized that the tip that almost took custody of Lucas from her didn't just come from a nosy neighbor, but from someone inside Ricardo's company, probably following orders to destabilize it once and for all. But the big twist came when Julia found a compromising video stored on her former employee's cell phone. The recording showed Ricardo, his mother, and his brother discussing how to manipulate the contracts to remove her and protect the real criminals. There was definitive proof that everything was premeditated. With her breathing quickened and her hands shaking, Julia knew she had only one chance to turn the tables. She sent the video and documents to an investigative journalist and at the same time filed an anonymous complaint with the IRS. If they wanted to get rid of her, they would now have to deal with something much bigger than they expected. The repercussion was instantaneous. Within hours, the complaint spread throughout the media and the Federal Revenue Service began a surprise audit of Ricardo's family company. Chaos ensued. Julia's mother-in-law tried to deny everything, but documents signed by her were found, proving her participation in the fraud. Ricardo's brother, desperate, tried to flee the country but was stopped at the airport, and Ricardo, he tried to stand his ground, claiming to be the victim of a conspiracy, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recording was leaked and went viral, unmasking not only the financial fraud, but also the manipulation against Julia. The company, which had previously been a source of pride for the family, was now on the brink of collapse. But revenge came with an even sweeter taste. With the noose tightening, Ricardo finally broke and tried to make a deal to reduce his sentence. In exchange, he handed over the person behind the false accusations against Julia and Lucas, his new wife. The same woman who had stolen the watch, embezzled money, and planted false evidence. The police found records of her illegal transactions and a history of manipulation that went beyond what Julia could have imagined. In the end, she not only cleared her name, but also made sure that those who tried to destroy her paid for every betrayal. With the truth exposed, Julia finally had a moment to breathe, but the battle was not over. Yet, despite all the evidence, the damage to her and Lucas's reputation would not disappear overnight. Some people still whispered behind her back, others looked askance, as if they doubted that it had all really been a setup, but she didn't care. The most important thing was that Lucas was safe. The attempt to take him away from her had failed, and now she had the power to rebuild her life without fear. To ensure that no one else would go through what she had, Julia decided to collaborate with the police, helping to expose not only the crimes of Ricardo's family, but also the schemes that harmed other employees of the company. And then came the most ironic part of all. With the company drowning in lawsuits and debts, Ricardo's family assets began to be confiscated, including the luxurious apartment where he lived with his new wife. The same woman who tried to destroy Julia was the first to abandon him when she realized he had nothing left to offer. In the end, Ricardo was left alone. Just as he had tried to leave Julia while he faced the consequences of his choices, she moved on, stronger than ever. And for the first time in a long time, she looked to the future with the certainty that no one would make a fool of her again. Julia decided that she would not go back to the life she had before. After everything she had been through, she realized that she no longer needed to hold on to a past that had only brought her pain and betrayal. With part of the money she had recovered and the compensation she had won in court, she invested in a new business far from the shadow of Ricardo's family. She bought a small cafe in the city center, a cozy place where she could start over without carrying the weight of the lies and traps that had almost destroyed her life. Lucas also had a new beginning. With his name cleared, he returned to school without fear of further attacks. The experience made him stronger, and he began to see his mother as a true warrior, someone who never let herself be defeated, no matter how unfair the game was. But fate had one last surprise in store for Ricardo and his family. Months later, a new investigation was opened, this time revealing that the crimes went far beyond what anyone had imagined. Ricardo, his mother, and his brother were involved in a money laundering scheme that had been monitored for years. With the new evidence, the sentences were increased, and they all ended up behind bars. Julia heard the news while having coffee at her new business, and for the first time, she didn't feel anger, fear, or resentment, only relief. She had won. Not only because she got justice, but because she got out of that story without becoming like them. Life went on, but Julia never forgot what happened. The trauma of the injustices she suffered made her see the world through different eyes, more attentive and cautious. She learned to trust only those who truly demonstrated loyalty and not those who just used pretty words. Her cafe prospered, becoming a meeting point for people who were looking for a new beginning, just like her. Some customers came just for the coffee, others for the welcoming atmosphere. But the ones who moved her the most were those who sat at a table and, without realizing it, shared stories of betrayal, disappointment, and overcoming. Julia listened to them all attentively, knowing that in each one, there was a piece of her own journey. And then, one day, without warning, she saw a familiar face walk through the door of the cafe. The former employee who had helped her through the most difficult time of her life walked in, now without the tense and scared look he had before. He just smiled and held out an envelope to her. "I thought you might want to see this." Inside were the final documents in the case against Ricardo and his family. Their last appeal had been denied. It was the definitive end to that story. Julia took a deep breath, looked at the past that was now nothing more than a memory, and smiled. She hadn't just survived, she had won.